I thought I would just come over to start. I'm sure you guys have a lot of questions, and obviously I haven't been available for like a week or so. So, um, first of all, I know what you guys are going to ask, and I did think it was a flagrant foul.
3 days after Caitlin Clark suffered a back injury from what sports media is calling a throat punch, the WNBA finally took action, but it was too little and far too late. A fist connected with Clark's throat while she lay defenseless
Um, and our refing just needs to be better. And, it's tough. Obviously, the refs are in a really difficult spot. It's one of the hardest jobs
on the ground, with an official standing just feet away. The whistle never came. The next day, the league retroactively upgraded the contact to a flagrant 2 foul and suspended Alyssa Thomas for 1 game, issuing a $1,000 fine. 1 game, for what Stephen
in the world, in my opinion, is to make calls. All you do is get yelled at the whole time by everybody. You're never winning.
Smith called a flagrant level of resentment that has plagued Clark since she arrived in the league. The offending player called it an accident. Her coach claimed the investigation was incomplete. Meanwhile, the WNBA's biggest star was injured. The backlash was exploding across national media, and the league's credibility
for us, as the league's just got to do better protecting our players in that regard. I don't really think that it was up for debate. Obviously, it wasn't called in real time.
Was in free fall. This moment would define whether the WNBA could protect its most valuable asset, or whether it would lose her entirely. June 24, 2024. Indiana Fever versus Phoenix Mercury, second quarter. A loose ball lies on the court, and for a brief moment, the game pauses in that familiar scramble for possession that defines basketball at every level. Caitlin Clark, diving for the ball, finds herself on the ground in a vulnerable position. The moment should have been routine, another competitive play in a professional game, but what happened next would become the most discussed 30 seconds in recent WNBA history. Alyssa Thomas, a veteran player with a reputation for physical defense, approached the fallen Clark. What occurred in that instant would be replayed thousands of times across every sports media platform, analyzed frame by frame, and debated by everyone from casual fans to Hall of Famers. A closed fist connected with Clark's throat, not a hand, not a push. A fist directed at the neck of a defenseless player lying on the floor. The ball was already gone, the play was essentially dead. There was no basketball justification for the contact, and standing mere feet away, positioned perfectly to see the entire sequence unfold, was an official. The referee had a clear sightline. The contact was obvious. Multiple angles would later confirm that there was simply no way the official could have missed what happened. Yet in that moment, no whistle came, no foul was called, no warning was issued. The official stood silently as Thomas stepped over the fallen Clark and walked away. Clark remained on the ground for a moment, processing what had just happened. She got up and continued playing, as athletes do, pushing through pain and shock to stay in the game. But something had shifted. By the third quarter, she was dealing with back pain significant enough that she had to leave the game. She did not return. The injury that would sideline her, that would limit her effectiveness in subsequent games, had begun in that moment when a closed fist connected with her neck. What made this moment so explosively significant, what transformed it from a bad call into a national scandal, was the context. This wasn't the first time Clark had been targeted with what observers characterized as excessive contact. This wasn't even the first time in that specific game. The pattern that fans and analysts had been tracking all season seemed to culminate in this single, undeniable act of aggression. The footage was unambiguous. There was no angle from which this contact could be interpreted as incidental or accidental. There was no argument that the official had been positioned poorly, or that the contact had been hidden. Everything about the moment screamed intention and negligence. And when the sports world woke up the next morning to see the footage plastered across every platform, the reaction was swift and unified in a way that transcended normal sports debate. This wasn't a judgment call. This wasn't a difference of opinion about whether contact rose to the level of a flagrant foul. This was a referee witnessing clear, unambiguous, dangerous contact and choosing, or appearing to choose, not to respond. For a new generation of fans who had only recently become invested in women's basketball because of Clark, this was their first visceral experience with what critics had been alleging all season, that the WNBA's officiating was compromised, that rules weren't being enforced equally, that certain players were being protected while others were being targeted. The injury to Clark gave the moment even more weight. This wasn't a controversial call that everyone could argue about without real consequences. This was contact that resulted in a visible injury to the league's biggest star. The injury meant games missed, effectiveness limited, and opportunity lost. It meant real consequences, not just in the moment but in her health and her season. For the WNBA, the moment represented a crisis point. This wasn't a situation that could be dismissed as misunderstanding or disagreement about interpretation. The league couldn't hide behind claims that the official had simply been out of position or that the angle made the contact unclear. Every defense that had worked in previous situations was useless here. The The footage was too clear, too dramatic, and too damaging. The league would have to respond, and how it responded would determine whether it could survive this moment or whether it would be fundamentally compromised in the eyes of its audience. The WNBA waited a full day before announcing any action. During that day, the footage spread across every sports platform. ESPN, Fox Sports, every major news outlet had the clip on rotation. Social media exploded with outrage. Fans who had invested in women's basketball felt betrayed. New viewers who had tuned in specifically to watch Clark saw this moment as their introduction to professional women's basketball, and it left a catastrophic first impression. When the league finally acted, it announced a retroactive upgrade of the contact to a flagrant 2 foul, a non-basketball act according to the league's official statement. Alyssa Thomas was suspended for 1 game. She was fined $1,000. The suspension would be served on the team's next game, removing Thomas from action for a single contest. The $1,000 fine, while a penalty, represented a relatively minor financial consequence for a professional athlete earning a significant salary. The response to these punishments was immediate and overwhelmingly negative. Across social media, mainstream sports media, and even traditional news outlets, the consensus was stunningly clear: the punishment was inadequate. This wasn't a controversial opinion held by a fringe segment of the fan base. This was the mainstream reaction. Even people who rarely followed women's basketball were asking the same question: how is a fist to the throat of a defenseless player a 1-game suspension? Stephen A. Smith, one of the most prominent voices in sports media, didn't simply criticize the punishment. He used his platform to articulate what many fans were feeling but hadn't found the words to express. He invoked historical parallels that everyone in sports leadership would recognize. When Michael Jordan was the target of excessive physical play from opponents, the NBA didn't hand out minimal suspensions. The league protected its asset. It changed the rules if necessary. It made it clear that certain treatment of star players would not be tolerated. Smith's invocation of the phrase "don't get in the way of the cash cow" became the rallying cry for everyone demanding change. It wasn't elegant language, and Smith himself acknowledged that, but it was precise. It captured the economic reality that the WNBA had been avoiding directly confronting. Caitlin Clark wasn't just another player. She was the foundation of the league's financial growth. She was responsible for billions in value creation through increased viewership, attendance, and sponsorship deals. She was the wave that the entire league was riding. And you don't let people throw fists at the wave, you protect it with everything you have. The response from within the basketball community was equally damaging to the league's credibility. Lisa Leslie, a WNBA legend, appeared on major television and didn't mince words. She said the official should have been able to see the play, that the league should have done better, and that the punishment seemed insufficient given what had actually occurred. Her voice carried weight because she was a Hall of Famer, a pioneer of women's basketball, someone who couldn't be dismissed as a hater or an outsider. LaShawn McCoy, a 2-time Super Bowl champion with a platform in sports media, made the NBA comparison explicit. He talked about how when significant players faced targeting, the NBA responded with rule changes and serious consequences. He asked directly, if the WNBA doesn't protect its young superstar, what's going to happen to the league? It was a question that seemed to demand an answer from league leadership. Phoenix Mercury head coach Nate Tibbetts took a different approach, defending his player while simultaneously revealing problems with the league's investigation process. Tibbetts alleged that the league had not conducted a thorough investigation, that they had not interviewed Thomas, her coach, or anyone from the team's security staff. The punishment, Tibbetts claimed, was based on social media screenshots rather than comprehensive fact-finding. This allegation added a new dimension to the scandal, not just that the punishment was light, but that the process by which the punishment had been determined was flawed and incomplete. The message from all these voices was the same: the WNBA had failed. It had failed to protect its star player on the court by enforcing the rules. It had failed to respond adequately after the fact, and it had failed to conduct a proper investigation before issuing penalties. Each failure compounded the credibility damage. 3 days after the incident, Alyssa Thomas finally spoke publicly. Her statement would become another focal point of controversy, not because of what she said, but because of what her words revealed about how the incident was being processed within the professional basketball community. Thomas called the play a complete accident. She said she didn't know it had happened until after the game, that no one on the bench or in the stands had noticed the contact in the moment. She was, by her own account, shocked when she found out about the play after the game had ended. This explanation raised immediate questions. How can a closed fist connecting with someone's throat be completely accidental? What does accident even mean in that context? The implication of Thomas's statement was that she had made the contact without intention, without awareness, without meaning. But the footage suggested otherwise. The contact appeared deliberate, directed, and forceful. The question of whether an act can be both accidental and also clearly visible on video as a forceful closed fist became a central point of debate. If it was truly accidental, how did it happen? If it was visible and deliberate, how could Thomas claim she didn't know? What struck many observers was the complete absence of accountability in Thomas's statement. She didn't apologize for the contact. She didn't express concern about Clark's injury. She didn't acknowledge that regardless of whether the contact was intentional, she had caused harm to another player. Instead, she positioned herself as a victim. She disclosed that she and her teammates had received death threats and racial slurs online, shifting the conversation away from what had happened to Clark and toward the harassment that Thomas was allegedly experiencing. The statement created a troubling dynamic. Two things could be true simultaneously. Thomas could have been subjected to unacceptable harassment online, and she could also have committed an unjustified foul that injured another player. But by leading with her victimhood, by framing the conversation around threats directed at her and her team, Thomas was attempting to reframe the narrative. She was trying to move the focus away from her responsibility and toward the consequences she was experiencing. This approach found support from her coach and from her team's organization. Nate Tibbetts, in his defense of Thomas, reinforced the message that the investigation had been inadequate and the punishment unjustified. The Phoenix Mercury organization circled the wagons, protecting their player and suggesting that the public and the media were being unfair. This institutional protection, this refusal to acknowledge that something inappropriate had occurred, sent a message to the broader WNBA community about what teams could expect if they faced similar situations. The accountability vacuum was staggering. No one directly involved, not Thomas, not her coach, not her organization, was willing to step back and say, "We understand why this looks bad. We understand why people are upset. We take responsibility." Instead, every statement was defensive, deflective, and focused on why the accused was actually the victim in the situation. This absence of accountability was precisely what made the moment so damaging to the league's credibility. If accountability existed, if players and coaches were willing to acknowledge errors and commit to change, then fans and observers could believe that the system could improve. But when faced with clear evidence of a violation, when met with reasonable criticism, the response was to double down, to defend, to position the accused as the real victim. That response suggested a culture that didn't value introspection or growth, that prioritized loyalty to teammates over fairness to opponents. The broader implications were significant. If a veteran player could commit what officials classified as a non-basketball act, essentially an off-court level violation that happened to occur during a game, and walk away with minimal consequences and community protection, what message did that send to other players? What did it suggest about what behavior was actually tolerated? What did it imply about who could be targeted with relative impunity? For new fans watching women's basketball for the first time because of Caitlin Clark, this response was deeply discouraging. They had watched a star player get fouled without consequence. They had seen the league hand out minimal punishment, and then they watched the offending player claim she had done nothing wrong and position herself as a victim. For people trying to develop genuine investment in the sport, this sequence of events was difficult to process, let alone to support. The incident and the league's response triggered a firestorm in sports media that transcended normal WNBA coverage. Major television networks devoted significant segments to the controversy. Podcasters dedicated entire episodes to analysis and debate. The story appeared on mainstream news broadcasts, not just sports news channels. What started as a WNBA officiating scandal became a broader conversation about power, protection, and what we value in professional sports. Stephen A. Smith's commentary became the centerpiece of the national conversation. His invocation of Michael Jordan and Magic Johnson created a historical framework that everyone in sports understood. He was saying that this wasn't just about how the WNBA treated players. It was about how the NBA, the NFL, and other professional sports leagues treated their superstars. It was about lessons that the sports world had already learned decades ago. Smith's characterization of Clark's position as the cash cow of the WNBA wasn't meant as derogatory language. It was meant as accurate economic description. Clark was driving viewership, attendance, and sponsorship revenue in ways that no other player was matching. She was the foundation of the league's financial growth, and that status came with certain implications about how she should be protected and valued. The historical parallel was crucial to the argument. When the Chicago Bulls faced the bad boy Pistons in the late 1980s, when physical play against Michael Jordan was threatening to derail the NBA's growth, the NBA didn't respond with minimal suspensions. The NBA changed the rules. The league made it clear that excessive physical play against star players would not be tolerated. The NBA understood that protecting its superstars was synonymous with protecting the league itself. The NFL had learned similar lessons. When opposing defenses were targeting star quarterbacks, the NFL implemented rules to protect those players. The league recognized that its biggest stars were assets that needed protection. The WNBA, according to critics, hadn't yet internalized this lesson. The league was acting as though protecting Caitlin Clark was somehow unfair to other players, as though enforcing the rules equally meant allowing excessive contact against the league's biggest star. Lisa Leslie's commentary added credibility to the criticism by coming from within the women's basketball community. She wasn't an outsider criticizing from a distance. She was a Hall of Famer with decades of experience in the sport. When Leslie said the league needed to do better, when she acknowledged that an official should have been able to see the contact, she was speaking as someone who understood women's basketball at the highest level and was expressing disappointment with how the league was handling the situation. Other voices joined the chorus. Analysts who didn't follow women's basketball closely found themselves drawn into the conversation because the underlying issues were universal to sports. Questions about fairness, about protection of assets, about systemic bias. These were topics that resonated across all sports communities. A fan who had never watched the WNBA before June 24 commented on social media, "I honestly don't watch a lot of WNBA games, but I'm watching this one. Is this normal for her? My goodness." That reaction captured the experience of countless new viewers whose introduction to professional women's basketball was poisoned by witnessing apparent mistreatment of the league's biggest star. The conversation also attracted voices from sports media who wanted to add a racial dimension to the analysis. Some commentators suggested that part of the tolerance for targeting Clark was rooted in racial dynamics. If Clark were a black player, would she be receiving the same treatment? The question wasn't definitively answered, but it added another layer to a conversation that was already complex and charged. What connected all these voices was a common theme. The WNBA had failed to protect its most valuable asset. It had failed to enforce rules fairly. It had failed to respond adequately to violations, and it was failing to demonstrate that it understood the economic and cultural value of what Caitlin Clark represented for the league. The national conversation was essentially an intervention, with various voices from sports media, sports leadership, and the general public telling the WNBA, "You're making a mistake. You're at risk of losing the most important thing that's happened to your league in years." What gave weight to Stephen A. Smith's characterization of a flagrant level of resentment toward Caitlin Clark was the context of the entire season. This single incident wasn't occurring in a vacuum. It was the culmination of months of observation by fans, analysts, and media members who had been tracking patterns of physicality directed specifically at Clark. Throughout the 2024 season, whenever Clark was involved in defensive exchanges, the contact seemed more intense, more aggressive, and less penalized than similar contact in other situations. When veteran defenders faced Clark, they seemed emboldened to play a particular style, aggressive, physical, borderline reckless, in ways they didn't when facing other players. And the officiating seemed calibrated to tolerate this specific level of physicality when directed at Clark while penalizing similar contact elsewhere on the court. This pattern didn't emerge from nowhere. It was rooted in the reality of Clark's arrival and impact on the WNBA. She had fundamentally altered the economics and visibility of women's basketball. Players who had been the faces of their franchises suddenly found themselves sharing the spotlight. Games that had been marquee matchups became secondary when they didn't involve Clark. National television coverage shifted toward games featuring her team. Sponsorship opportunities pivoted toward her image and brand. The attention and resources that had been distributed across the league suddenly concentrated around a single rookie. From the perspective of veteran players who had invested years in the WNBA, who had built their careers during a period when the league received minimal investment and attention, the sudden shift could feel threatening. These veterans had sacrificed significantly to play professional basketball, had endured years of limited media coverage and sponsorship opportunities, and had hoped that their contributions would eventually receive recognition. The arrival of Clark, whose college career had generated unprecedented viewership and whose professional entry had continued that phenomenon, could understandably generate complicated emotions. This didn't excuse targeting or resentment, but it explained the psychological environment in which such feelings could flourish. In this context, veteran players might rationalize physical play against Clark as evening the playing field, as pushback against what they perceived as unfair advantages she was receiving due to media hype and fan enthusiasm. If Clark was getting all the attention, if she was benefiting from new opportunities and investment that weren't available to veterans, then maybe those veterans deserved to play differently against her, without the normal constraints of officiating consistency. The problem with this rationalization was that it was precisely what Stephen A. Smith was warning against. The entire foundation of professional sports growth was predicated on protecting and developing superstars, not resentfully targeting them. The NBA's experience had demonstrated that when teams and players tried to physically suppress a star's emergence through targeting and excessive contact, the result wasn't that the star was suppressed. The result was that the entire league suffered reputational damage, and rule changes were eventually implemented anyway. Moreover, the resentment narrative failed to account for economic reality. Caitlin Clark's success benefited every player in the WNBA. The increased television deals, the expanded sponsorship investments, the growing attendance figures, these benefited all teams and all players, not just Clark's team. A rising tide doesn't just lift the boat it raises, it lifts all boats. By bringing new viewership and investment to women's basketball, Clark was expanding the pie for everyone, not just taking a larger slice of an existing pie. Yet understanding this economic reality didn't necessarily translate to psychological acceptance. The human tendency to resent changes to established hierarchies, to resist disruptions to power structures, is powerful. When a rookie arrives and fundamentally alters the landscape, when years of seniority and experience suddenly matter less than marketability and fan appeal, the resentment can be palpable even if it's economically irrational. What made Stephen A. Smith's commentary so powerful was that he acknowledged all of this. The resentment was real, the psychological tension was understandable, but he also insisted that it had to be overcome. He was essentially telling the WNBA and its players, this is a test. Will you protect your greatest asset? Will you ride the wave that she's created? Will you understand that her success is your success? Or will you let resentment derail the most important thing that's happened to your league in decades? The economic case for protecting Caitlin Clark was staggering in its clarity. Multiple analyses conducted during the 2024 season suggested that Clark was responsible for approximately 25% of the WNBA's total revenue. That figure, if accurate, represented not just a significant portion of league revenue but a transformative percentage. Typically, no single player accounts for a quarter of an entire league's economic output. Even superstar athletes in established leagues usually represent a smaller percentage of total revenue because the revenue base is so large and so diversified. The WNBA's small size relative to major professional sports leagues meant that Clark's impact was proportionally larger. Every game she played generated measurable increases in television viewership. Networks reported that ratings spiked when Clark was on air. Attendance at games featuring her team far exceeded attendance at other matchups. Corporate sponsors specifically mentioned her in their reasons for investing in WNBA partnerships. The merchandise sales data showed her outpacing other players by significant margins. This economic concentration created an interesting dynamic. On one hand, it demonstrated the unprecedented value Clark was creating. No previous WNBA player had ever generated this kind of revenue concentration. It was a sign of the league's growth potential. On the other hand, it represented significant risk. If that revenue stream were to dry up, if Clark were injured, if she became discouraged and left the league, if the novelty wore off, the WNBA would face a financial cliff that could be difficult to navigate. The injury that Clark suffered as a result of the uncalled foul made this risk visceral. She wasn't simply being targeted in a game, she was being targeted in ways that could result in physical injury that would limit her availability and effectiveness. Every game she missed due to injury was a game where the WNBA would lose a measurable portion of its revenue. Every reduction in her performance due to pain or physical limitations would affect viewership and attendance. For the league's leadership, this should have created obvious incentives to protect Clark. But the league's response suggested that either the leadership didn't fully grasp the economic reality, or they were willing to accept the risks in favor of other considerations. The minimal punishment, the inadequate investigation, the apparent willingness to tolerate aggressive play against Clark, all of these decisions implied that economic incentives weren't driving league policy in this situation. What LaShawn McCoy and others were essentially arguing was that the WNBA should learn from the lessons that other professional sports leagues had already internalized. When you have a superstar who's transforming your league economically, you protect that player, you change rules if necessary. You enforce regulations consistently to prevent targeting. You make it clear to the entire ecosystem that this particular asset is protected and valued. The NBA had done this with Jordan. The league had ultimately done this with LeBron James. The NFL had done this with elite quarterbacks. The PGA had recognized Tiger Woods' transformative impact on golf and had structured the sport to capitalize on his presence. In each case, the league's leadership had recognized that protecting the superstar was synonymous with protecting the league's interests. The WNBA, by contrast, seemed to be operating as though protecting Clark would somehow be unfair to other players, as though competitive balance required allowing her to be targeted and physically suppressed. This was a fundamental misunderstanding of how professional sports actually work. Competitive balance doesn't require equal harm to superstars, it requires equal enforcement of rules. If the rules are enforced equally, then competitive balance exists even if one player is more talented than others and therefore more successful. The economic argument was essentially a warning. If the WNBA continues on its current trajectory, if it continues to respond inadequately to targeting and injury of its biggest star, if it fails to demonstrate that it values and protects Clark, then the economic growth that the league has experienced could reverse itself. Players might become discouraged, fans might lose interest, sponsors might reduce their commitments. The league would find itself in a far weaker position than it currently occupies, having failed to capitalize on the most transformative player in its history. The Caitlin Clark situation, while specific to the WNBA, revealed broader patterns about how women's sports are governed compared to men's professional leagues. The differences were instructive and troubling. When a superstar in a men's league faces targeting, the machinery of the sport moves quickly and decisively. Rule changes are implemented, penalties are severe, the entire system mobilizes to protect the asset. When a superstar in a women's league faces targeting, the response is measured, cautious, and often inadequate. Some observers attributed this difference to institutional factors. Men's leagues have longer histories, more established governance structures, and more entrenched power bases. These systems have had decades to develop protocols for handling crises and protecting superstars. Women's leagues, being younger and smaller, haven't had the same time to develop these institutional responses. They're still figuring things out. This institutional immaturity explanation had some validity, but it didn't fully account for what was happening in the WNBA specifically. The WNBA had been operating since 1996. The league had professional administrative structures, governance protocols, and institutional experience. The excuse that the league was too young to handle complex situations didn't hold up under scrutiny. Other organizations of similar age and size had developed more robust systems for responding to crises and protecting their assets. Another explanation involved gender dynamics and the perceived cultural hierarchy within sports. Some commentators suggested that there was a fundamental difference in how men's sports and women's sports were valued culturally, and that this difference translated into how carefully their superstars were protected. If women's sports were seen as less serious, less important, or less central to sports culture, then perhaps their superstars received less protection as a reflection of that cultural perception. This explanation was more difficult to test and more uncomfortable to discuss directly, but it was worth considering. How much of the WNBA's inadequate response to the Clark situation was driven by a genuine belief that women's basketball didn't warrant the same level of investment in governance and superstar protection that men's sports received? If the league's leadership had viscerally understood that Clark was as valuable and transformative as Jordan or LeBron, would the response have been different? The race dimension added another layer of complexity. Some commentators pointed out that the way Clark was being treated was qualitatively different from how black superstars in other sports had been treated. This observation wasn't meant to minimize what Clark had experienced, but rather to acknowledge that different players faced different challenges and received different types of protection. A black female player in the WNBA might face entirely different pressures and treatment than a white female player, even if they generated similar economic value. These observations about gender and race dynamics weren't meant to excuse the WNBA's inadequate response or to suggest that the league was uniquely or consciously discriminatory. Rather, they were meant to highlight how structural factors, cultural hierarchies, and historical patterns could influence how institutions responded to crises even when those institutions wanted to behave fairly and justly. The broader implication was that women's sports governance needed to be more intentional about learning from the mistakes and lessons that men's sports had already learned. Women's leagues didn't need to start from scratch in developing protocols for protecting superstars. They could adopt and adapt proven models from established leagues, but doing so required acknowledging that protecting superstars was a legitimate function of league governance, not something that compromised competitive integrity or fairness. It also required recognizing that women's sports superstars faced unique pressures and challenges that might warrant specific attention. The resentment directed at Clark, the physical targeting, the minimization of her value, these phenomena had gendered dimensions that likely wouldn't manifest identically in men's sports. A women's league wanting to protect its superstar female players might need to be more proactive and more explicit about values and expectations than a men's league would be. The Clark situation would likely become a case study in women's sports governance, taught to future administrators as an example of how not to respond to a crisis. But the real value of the case study would be if it prompted women's sports organizations to think more carefully about their governance structures, their relationship to superstars, and their commitment to enforcing rules fairly and protecting their most valuable assets. In the aftermath of the throat punch heard around the world, the question facing the WNBA was straightforward: what happens now? The incident had exposed vulnerabilities in how the league operated. The response had damaged the league's credibility. The national conversation had made clear that fans, analysts, and sports media expected more from the league than it had demonstrated. Continuing on the current trajectory was no longer a viable option. The immediate need was for the WNBA to develop more rigorous protocols for investigating incidents and determining appropriate punishments. The allegation that the league had issued suspensions based on social media screenshots rather than thorough investigation was damaging. Professional sports leagues needed to demonstrate that they had professional investigation processes, that they gathered evidence comprehensively, that they interviewed relevant parties, and that punishments were determined based on complete information rather than reactive response to public outcry. The league also needed to develop clearer standards for what constituted appropriate punishment for different violations. A fist to the throat of a defenseless player should result in severe consequences: multiple game suspension, significant fine, or both. 1 game and $1,000 was insufficient. The league needed to establish that certain violations would trigger certain minimum penalties, so players and fans alike understood what consequences would follow what actions. Beyond investigation and punishment protocols, the league needed to examine its relationship to officiating and rule enforcement. If the allegations that officials were facing pressure to manage how games were officiated had any validity, the league needed to address that systematically. Officials needed clear directives that their job was to enforce the rules as written, period. They needed to understand that deviations from this directive, whether motivated by concern about veteran player satisfaction or any other factor, would have professional consequences. The league also needed to make explicit that protecting its superstars was a legitimate governance objective. Commissioner Kathy Engelbert needed to state clearly and publicly that Caitlin Clark was valued by the organization, that she would be protected by fair and consistent enforcement of the rules, and that the league understood the economic and cultural significance of her presence. This statement needed to be backed by concrete actions, not just rhetoric. Culturally, the league needed to foster an environment where veteran players understood that rising tides lift all boats. The resentment that Stephen A. Smith identified wasn't unique to the WNBA. It was a natural human response to disruption, but professional organizations had systems and cultures for managing that resentment, for redirecting it toward productive channels, and for fostering the understanding that a player's rising success benefited everyone in the ecosystem. This might require explicit conversations with veteran players about the economics of the league, about how Clark's presence was expanding opportunities for everyone, about how the success of the league was in everyone's interests. It might require leadership from established players who could model acceptance of the new hierarchy and could convince younger or less secure players to embrace rather than resent Clark's prominence. The league also needed to communicate more clearly with new fans about what to expect. The influx of viewers who had never watched women's basketball before because of Clark deserved to feel that the league valued their engagement and that they were investing in an organization that was committed to fair competition and player safety. When those new fans witnessed apparent mistreatment of the player who had attracted them, when they saw minimal consequences for dangerous contact, they were likely to lose confidence in the organization and potentially stop investing. Finally, the WNBA needed to consider whether rule changes were necessary. The NBA, when faced with excessive physical play against superstars, had modified rules to reduce the scope for physical defense. The WNBA could do the same if necessary. The league could establish clearer guidelines about what constituted unnecessary contact, what body parts were off-limits, what consequences would follow violations. Whether such changes were needed should be determined by comprehensive analysis rather than reactive decision-making, but they should be on the table if the data suggested that current rules weren't adequately protecting players. The bottom line was that the WNBA had an opportunity, albeit an uncomfortable one, to learn from a crisis and improve. The incident had exposed weaknesses in governance, investigation, and enforcement. The national conversation had clarified what stakeholders expected from the league. The question was whether league leadership would use this moment to implement systematic improvements, or whether it would default to the path of least resistance and hope that the crisis gradually faded from public attention. The choice would determine not just whether Clark remained confident and engaged in the WNBA, but whether the league could sustain the growth trajectory that her arrival had initiated. A closed fist connected with Caitlin Clark's throat on national television. An official stood mere feet away and blew no whistle. The WNBA suspended the offending player for 1 game and fined her $1,000. The response was inadequate, and the sports world said so, unanimously and loudly. The incident became a flashpoint for a broader conversation about whether the WNBA understood the value of its most transformative player, and whether the league was willing to protect that value with serious governance. Stephen A. Smith's warning, "Don't get in the way of the cash cow," became the rallying cry for a nation watching a league risk losing everything that was working. The question wasn't whether Caitlin Clark deserved better treatment, the question was whether the WNBA deserved to keep her. If the league couldn't demonstrate that it valued, protected, and committed to supporting its superstar, the answer would become increasingly clear. The moment to respond seriously and systematically had arrived.